Welcome. I'm joined today with Erez Ben-Yosef, the director of the Central Timna Valley project, which is actually where we are here today. And Erez and one of his colleagues, Zachary Thomas, actually recently wrote an article for Biblical Archaeology Review, kind of discussing archaeology's relationship to the kingdom of David and Solomon. And you kind of came at it from a very interesting direction. So can you just tell me a little bit about how archaeologists have historically thought about the kingdom of David and Solomon, how they've looked for it, and kind of what you and Zachary did differently?
Well, if you ask any biblical archaeologist, what is the biblical kingdom, or even a biblical scholar, when we think about kingdoms in this period, in the Iron Age, we always think about settled people. So the underlying assumption is that you have to have a settled population in order to have a kingdom. And what we are saying is actually that this basic assumption is not correct. Mm-hmm. This is very significant, because if we are able to consider nomadic kingdoms or semi-nomadic kingdoms, or a kingdom based on nomads and settled people together, it's a major change in the way we understood the period of the ancient Israelite monarchy, the United Monarchy, and actually it's a basic change in the methodology of how we can reconstruct social events and social processes out of archaeology. And what we claim, based on the research in the Arava, where we are here in Timna Valley, but also in Feinan, on the other side in Jordan, is that we have clear evidence that in exactly this time period, the early Iron Age, we had nomadic kingdoms. At least one that we have physical evidence for it, which is the early Edomite kingdom, but we think that this evidence has implications for understanding the other neighboring kingdoms, Ammon, Moab, and of course ancient Israel. And you should remember that everybody agrees that the origin of these local kingdoms was nomadic. It's almost a consensus. Very few scholars believe that they were Canaanite in origin and settled people in origin, but most scholars in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv accept the nomadic origin of these ancient peoples of the land of Canaan, or these ancient peoples that created kingdoms. Yeah. But until the recent years, recent publications, including the one that is upcoming in Bar, the assumption was that until all of these nomads settled down, built cities, built villages, became completely agriculturalists, we cannot talk about kingdoms. And this assumption is based on many things. One is our preconception of nomads in general, and prejudices against nomads. Also, because of our understanding of the current nomads of the region. When you think about biblical nomad, the first thing that comes to mind for, again, biblical scholars and archaeologists would be, of course, the current example, which is the Bedouin tribes of the southern Levant. And the Bedouin tribes are considered to be, on the one hand, the best example and a very exotic example, the nomads of the Orient. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they are considered to be against central governments. Mm-hmm. They are considered to be, their land is a land without law. Imagine like early explorers, early adventurers in the 19th century going to the Dead Sea. So their descriptions are quite romantic on the one hand, but they are depicting a place without law, and it's definitely not something that we can consider to be the basis of a great kingdom or something like that. And this is so much entrenched in our interpretation that we couldn't think about exceptions. And what we see here is definitely strong evidence that the early Iron Age was an exceptional period in the longue durée of the region. And in this particular period, after the end of the Egyptian hegemony on the region, and with the climate, the drier climate, that we have more and more evidence that this was the case in this period, there was an advantage for these tribal societies to get together to create tribal coalitions and to establish something very different than the usual nomads that we imagine. Something that may be a bit similar to the early days of the Nabatean kingdom. That was a kingdom already still when they were nomads. Mm-hmm. They settled down, but it took them a while to do that. So that's what is the evidence? The evidence is here the amazing story of copper production.
Here at Timna?
Here at Timna. It's a big area. It's not a single site. We have thousands of mines all around us and several central smelting camps. Smelting camps are the place where the furnaces were, where they smelted copper. You see this black material all around us. This is the leftover of copper smelting. Yeah, exactly, this piece. It looks like a rock, but it's man-made. It's human-made. People were producing this in vast quantities. And it's very visible. The mines are visible, the industrial waste is visible, and we can come here and see this ancient society and its activity. And until we came here first time in 2009, it's quite a while ago, this was considered to be a project of the Egyptian Empire. Okay. And the mines in Feinan were considered to be the project of the Assyrian Empire. Mm. And in recent years, more and more radiocarbon dates came from the excavations of the American team in Feinan and our team here in Timna. And now it's clear that the main activity here was after the Egyptians left the valley, after the collapse of the Egyptian hegemony over Canaan.
So who was here then?
So even during the Egyptian phase, they didn't work alone. They worked with the local tribes that, for a few generations worked under the Egyptian control. And actually this is what I think was how they learned how to establish a kingdom. They learned the political institutions, how to make people work together, how to make people work for the elite. It was, even in the Egyptian phase, it was not only the stick. They came with a military force, but probably also convinced the local leaders to work with them with the carrot. They could have benefit from it. They could share the very lucrative product, which is copper, which is the most expensive product at the time. Like, it's a source of not only beautiful stuff, it's a source for weapon and agricultural tools. Like you produce bronze. So whoever had control over this resource was very strong. So the local leaders working under the Egyptians learned how to establish political mechanisms, institutions. That will be the basis of the Edomite state to come. And after the Egyptians left one day, because of their own problems, the Egyptian great empire collapsed. They became fragmented and much smaller than before. The local tribes had the opportunity to create something big. They get together with the tribes of the northern Arabah and actually the neighboring region, the Negev, the Edomite highlands, and established a nomadic kingdom. Okay. And it is a nomadic kingdom because we don't have their houses, we don't have their villages, we don't have cities and walls. What we excavate is the mines and the industrial sites. This is the hilltop here, where we have this amazing industry from the 10th century BCE, is a copper production factory from the days of King David and Solomon, but not the habitation of these people. Okay. We should imagine their tent camps all around us. And this is a very important point because we don't find their tent camps. If we look very carefully, we can find remains of tents here and there, which are very hard to date, but they don't tell us much of the big story that we see in the copper production remains. Let's say it in other words. If these people, these nomads, were still part of a strong kingdom, but their economy was anything else, like a trade, the incense trade or whatever, we wouldn't know about it or anything archaeologically. If we were to find their tents, we could have said maybe that some Bedouins were here. But even then, it's very hard to date these remains, and probably the archaeologists would have said there is a chronological gap. There is nothing here in the land of Edom that can be related to the biblical narrative of David, because the first settled sites in Edom appears only in the late 8th century BCE, many centuries after the period of Slaves' Hill. So this is a major methodological insight, because it's just a chance that these people, this kingdom engaged in copper production, and this chance is telling us something very different than what we would expect if we were to rely on the Bedouin model, if we were to think that the nomads of the time were only simple society like the Bedouins of today. And this is a very important lesson also for the study of ancient Israel, because also here most scholars, or all scholars, are going with the assumption that you have to have a settled society in order to have a kingdom, and a settled society with all of the attributes of a settled urban society, meaning a big city, a big wall, a big stone palace for David, the gates of Solomon. So if you follow me, the lesson here tells me, as a biblical scholar if you want, that I can agree with the low chronology. I completely accept that the walls and the gates of Gezer, and especially Megiddo, should be dated to the 9th century, what will leave us with a very little, less impressive city in the 10th century, but still believe that there is a grain of history in the narrative of the United Monarchy, because the United Monarchy doesn't have to be reflected in monumental buildings, and this is the big issue. And the Bar article is actually based on a much longer academic article in the Journal of Archaeological Research. It's an international journal which deals with big overviews, methodological questions and stuff like that. And in this paper, the title we chose was Complexity Without Monumentality in Biblical Times. So complexity without monumentality, this means that we can have a complex society, we can have what the biblical author can depict as a kingdom, but still without monumental buildings. It's not a prerequisite in order to reconstruct a history of a united monarchy that had control over vast areas. This control, by the way, might have been by just an agreement, a pact, a deal with the Edomites. You bring me 10 ingots of copper every year, and we won't disturb your trade. This is enough for the biblical author to imagine the subjugation of the Edomites to Jerusalem. We don't have to find a colony of buildings from Jerusalem with pottery from Jerusalem here in order to reconstruct such a relationship. I'm not saying that we have the answers. Definitely there is a lot that we don't know. We can't tell if this biblical narrative about the conquest of Edom is historical or not, but archaeology can definitely not negate the biblical narrative. We actually now have a fantastic background for David's conquests in the south, in the land of Edom, of Solomon, David's son, building a port in Elat, in Etzion Gaber, which is explicitly, it says in the book of Kings that it's in the land of Edom. So we are in the land of Edom. According to the Bible, it was subjugated to Jerusalem, but this is where the Edomites lived. And indeed, what we find in the material culture, that we are talking about the local tribes, the pottery is locally produced, and their daily life are based here, not in Timna per se, because there is no water. It's not a very easy place to live, but next to the water sources in the Arava, the big oasis like in Yotvata. Not 15 kilometers from here. So these local people were the ones that were responsible for this industry. If Jerusalem benefited from it or not, don't have a bulletproof evidence, but it makes a lot of sense that everybody around the Arava everyone that borders the Arava benefited from this trade. And we also have evidence that a lot of the supplies here came from the north. So we have grapes, hundreds and thousands of grapes that have to come from the Shvela or the Judean, the Hebron Hills, or we have fish, plenty of fish for the elite of the society. And this fish came from the Mediterranean Sea, not from the Red Sea. It's quite surprisingly, but the fish sources were from the north, from Philistia probably. And one of the most interesting discoveries of recent years was done by Naama Sukenik in the lab. You know that Timna, one of the advantages here is the dry climate. So the preservation of organic material is extraordinary. And we have a fantastic assemblage of textiles, of leather, ropes, cordage, all of these things that even if you will dig Jerusalem another 200 years, you won't find there.
Just because of the climate.
Just because of the climate, and also the rapid accumulation of stuff, because it was an industrial site.
Yeah.
So they produced copper and threw away the garbage, the waste, and the fast burial of this waste is also a factor. Together with the dry climate, we have an excellent conditions for preservation of organic materials. And Naama analyzed one of 3 little fragments that are in the color purple in the lab, and was able to show that this is true purple, meaning that it was made out of the Mediterranean sea snails with the very sophisticated technology of dyeing that is attributed to the Phoenicians mostly, and it's dated to the late 11th, 10th centuries BCE. Again, it's the most expensive dye stuff in antiquity. It is considered to be the color of priests and kings. It's the color argaman in the Hebrew Bible. Very famous. I think you had a short paper on that in Bar
we did. We covered that as well.
Exactly. So, you think about that, it's physical, and let's go back to the beginning.
Yeah.
It's physical evidence of a very expensive material that can be how these leaders, how the king of the Edomites, if you want, could manifest his power.
Yeah.
Because you ask yourself, what are, these nomads, they didn't build a big stone palace, so how did they present their status, how the leaders presented their social status and importance. So you can see that they can have beautiful garments, they can have big herds of sheep and goat and even cattle, they can have a big tent. So all of these things that we are not directly visible to us, and usually we don't have any evidence for them. But here, in this case, we were lucky enough that these nomads came year after year after year after year, smelted copper in the same spot, and we just have accumulation of material culture that we usually don't have for nomads. So it's kind of something very unique in world archaeology. If you want to study nomads, usually it's very difficult. You can find maybe their tents and say something, maybe they were here or they were there, but saying something about their social organization, about how complex they were, is impossible. It's really literally impossible, and this is why we are so strongly attached to the ethnography, to the Bedouin model. And for us, this is the best we could have done. And but now we have strong evidence that this was not the case for the early Iron Age. And if we were talking about the purple garment, let's go back to the Bible. It was used argaman as the color of the high priest and many other things. But also there is a very interesting story in the book of Judges. Gideon, a local leader from the north, from the hill country, north relative to here, he fought the Midianites. We know that the Midianites were a neighboring entity to Edom, somewhere around here, probably a little bit farther south. So they had a big fight with Gideon and they were defeated. And what was one of the spoils that Gideon took from the Midianites?
Argaman?
The argaman garments of the kings of Midian, specifically the kings of Midian. And now let's go back to the biblical scholar sitting in his or her office, trying to imagine the kings of Midian. The first thing that will come to their mind would be a palace, a capital city, a stone palace, something that is related to the settled society,
Yeah.
to an urban culture. But I'm saying no.
Okay.
It could have been nomadic kings. And this is a game changer, because when we go back to archaeology now, the fact that we don't find a capital city and a wall and a stone palace doesn't mean that this description is not historical. So it actually undermines the role of archaeology in the big discussion between archaeology and biblical scholarship.
Okay.
You understand?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
now archaeology, of course, the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible, is a very complex book, and there is a lot of things that are much later than the periods that supposedly are related to. But archaeology can no longer be the high court in this kind of decisions, especially for the early part of the emergence of these nomadic kingdoms or kingdoms in this region, and including ancient Israel, because ancient Israel, as I said, everybody accepts its nomadic origin, and you see it everywhere when you read the Bible, including in the days of David. David was a shepherd, right, from Bethlehem, and then when he goes to Jerusalem, and he conquered an already existing city. It was a Canaanite city, so he didn't build any city from scratch.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that, one night he will become an urban person with all the attributes that are related to somebody that grew up in Manhattan. It's not the case. He will keep the same traditions, the same symbolic life, and it will take generations for this to change until the Israelites will become a completely urban society centuries later. But still, the fact that they preserve some of their nomadic background and nomadic symbols, nomadic culture, doesn't mean that they necessarily have been small, unimportant entity in the south. Not at all. And this is the big mistake that was part of biblical archaeology and actually also biblical scholarship from its early days. And now we need to rethink all of that. And I think it is very interesting, because the core of the biblical story is about nomadic tribes doing a lot of new things. And if you think about the period, the Egyptian collapse, the Canaanite cities could not call for help anymore, like we hear in the Amarna letters, right? Every time the Apiru or the Shasu were making trouble, they called for help from Egypt, and now there is no more Egypt. So maybe the boss changed, and it became actually the nomadic tribes that were the most dominant entity in the region. And this is actually in the Hebrew Bible. And our assumption as Western scholars, with all of the biases and prejudices and preconceptions that we have, it's like rooted in us to be kind of against the ability of nomads to create something strong. And I still have this argument with my colleagues, especially in Tel Aviv University, because it's so much entrenched in the way we think, in the way we used to think, at least, about these marginal societies, these Bedouins and the uncivilized Bedouins at the margins of society. So this is the big methodological insight, and this is the article that is upcoming in Bar. And those who are interested can go to and read the long academic article in the Journal of Archaeological Research, Complexity Without Monumentality in Biblical Times, together with Zachary Thomas, who was a postdoc of mine for 2 years, and his work is actually much more related to the text, and together we put forward this new methodological approach that takes into consideration the possibility that nomads in the early Iron Age created complex societies that, except from the unique case of Edom, didn't leave much behind.
Awesome. Well, that pretty much answers all of my questions, so thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me, and best of luck as you continue to excavate this incredible place.
Most welcome. Thanks for coming.
Yep. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and sign up for our digital newsletter so that you can stay up to date on everything from the world of biblical archaeology. And if you would like to see more, why not check out one of the videos on your screen right now.